young ladies had been attacked in the street and hit over the back of the head. The risk was, because he attacked it as a blitz attack, we're going to have another murder, but we can't prevent it.
In the early noughties, nightclub bouncer Levi Bellfield attacked at least 4 innocent women across West London and Surrey. His youngest known victim was just 13 years old.
Nothing ever matters to Levi apart from Levi. And when you combine that with somebody who's got a kind of sadism and kind of propensity to use violence in the way that he has, you've got a really dangerous mix.
This is Matt from Underworld Uncut. This week, we're speaking with former Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton about how he and his team captured the infamous bus stop killer. When did you first get involved in the case?
Well, I got involved when Amélie Delagrange was murdered in August 2004, and I got the phone call to say there's been a murder and we'd like you to investigate it from my bosses. So I went over to Twickenham police station and learnt that Amélie was a French girl. She was 22 years old. She'd been living in Twickenham, near Twickenham Green, working as a waitress, and she rented a room. She had a boyfriend who was another French man, and was generally enjoying life in London. She had been in Twickenham town centre doing a bit of shopping, then met up with some of her friends on the night she was murdered, and she got the bus from Twickenham town centre to Twickenham Green, and for whatever reason she missed her stop. And we know from the driver that she sort of said, "Well, I've missed my stop, what time's the next bus back up?" And he said, "Oh, it's 15 minutes. And it was a nice night in August, and she thought, "Oh, it's not very far, I'll walk." And that was her fateful decision. Had she waited for the bus, she may well have been okay that night. And at about 10:15, there's a young man walking around Twickenham Green and found what he thought at first was just a bundle of rags or a bundle of clothes, but turned out to be Amélie, and she was lying there on the grass. Her shopping bag with her shopping in was next to her, and she had a single wound across the back of the head, was bleeding profusely. He called for an ambulance, and she was taken to hospital and died an hour or so later of this single wound, which had caused a catastrophic sort of fracture to her skull and a brain injury.
What were your initial steps into finding Amélie's killer?
The first thing that was a line of inquiry that needed looking at was the fact that the team that were on duty during the night, that were first called out before they handed it to me, had contacted the mobile phone company and asked them where Amélie's mobile phone was, because it wasn't with her, her handbag wasn't with her. And they were able, from the phone company, to get the information that her phone had switched off from the network, had been lost by the network, if you like, at Walton-on-Thames at a particular time. Well, this time was something like 8 or 9 minutes after she was found dying on Twickenham Green. And Walton-on-Thames is a considerable distance away, and it pointed to the bag with her phone in it having been taken away by somebody in a vehicle. So virtually the first thing we did was to plot, a map between Twickenham Green and Walton-on-Thames Bridge, where we know that the phone was last on the network. I want to grab all the CCTV that there is there, and we may not even look at it for months. But when we get somewhere on this investigation and we know what we're looking for, we can go back to it and see if we can find it. It had all the kind of characteristics of a completely random attack, and they're often the very hardest to investigate, because not only do you not have the links to help you, but also they're quite often those murders that are pre-planned. And when people pre-plan murders, they tend to think about DNA and fingerprints and things, and all the things that we can use in most murder cases. And these are the thoughts that are going through my mind as we're looking at the first few hours. As we looked at that, we were conscious that there had been a number of similar attacks in the area over the preceding sort of 18 months or so. One of those was the murder of Marsha McDonnell.
Who was Marsha McDonnell?
Marsha was a 18-year-old girl. She'd been to the cinema in Kingston with her friends, had got a bus home, and she was murdered between the bus stop and her house where she lived with her parents. She was murdered 50 yards from her front door. That had been investigated by another team in the Homicide and Serious Crime Command, and their investigations had led them to a 16-year-old youth who wasn't in the best of mental health, to put it mildly, and really wasn't competent to be charged or even really interrogated about the offence. And as a result, he was sectioned and was put into to some sort of institution. And although he hadn't been charged with the offence, everybody kind of thought, well, it was him, and so we can put that offence to bed, and you know, we've solved that, if you like. Then, of course, when Amélie gets murdered in the same way, in the same sort of circumstances, in the same sort of area, the first thing we did was to say, well, where was this 16-year-old last night? And the answer was he was securely locked up in somewhere in the northeast of the country, so it couldn't have been him. So either it was wrong and he wasn't Marsha's killer, or we had a copycat. Either way, we had to then include Marsha's murder into the investigation into the death of Amélie that we were already undertaking. Marsha was killed with a single blow to the back of the head with a heavy implement. We never found out what that implement was. Looking at the pathology and the type of wound that she sustained, it was obviously something very heavy and very hard, probably with a square edge. And that was virtually the same as the wound that was inflicted on Amélie Delagrange as well. We can't say it was the same implement, but it could have been. Marsha was found on the street where she lived, 10 or 15 doors down from her parents' house. The local resident heard a noise, heard a whimpering, if you like, and called police, and she was found there with this terrible head wound, and she was taken to hospital and died 2 or 3 days afterwards. She was unconscious from the time of the attack, yeah. She wasn't able to help us at all.
Were Marsha and Amélie the only cases you investigated?
There had been other similar attacks in that sort of area. There was another 16-year-old schoolgirl that she was thought at first to have slipped over in the snow and banged her head. And it was only then when Marsha was murdered that police looked at this occurrence some 2 months previously and realised that that could have been an assault as well. And the interesting thing was that the women that survived fell forwards. The two that died, Marsha and Amélie, fell backwards and were found on their backs. The ladies that survived had no recollection at all of what happened. They just, said, I was walking along, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in hospital some hours or some days later. So we didn't have any kind of clue or sighting that led us towards the suspect for it, because they just simply couldn't remember it. There was certainly a striking physical similarity between most of the victims. They ranged in age between sort of 16 and 32. They were all blonde or blondish, and I guess all of them were well dressed and were quite kind of sophisticated, looked quite well off, rather than perhaps some of the other people in the street. There was a kind of a type there.
When was the breakthrough in the case?
I got a team that was consisted of 6 officers. As a result of that, they did a fantastic piece of work where they spotted that there was this little white Ford van that appeared, sat next to the green at a place, 60 yards from where Amélie was found. And it was there for less than 8 minutes and drove away again. And, that becomes something of great interest, because why? Why would somebody be there? It was on the south side of the green. There were no shops, there were no garages or anything else, a pub or anything like that would cause somebody to park there for a short time. As the weeks progressed, they found 20 or 30 sightings of this van, separate bits of CCTV. And that's when we built up the picture of this van circling Twickenham Green effectively and driving around for a period of something like 45 minutes before Amélie was murdered. We had to try and identify who was in it. So we looked at it and everybody thought it was probably a Ford. So we phoned up Ford and said, do you have somebody there who could look at our pictures and confirm that this is what we think it is? And they said, it's a courier produced between September 1995 and 2002. And this all sounded really good and really positive. We could narrow the field down. And then we realised there were still 25,000 of those vans in the UK, registered in the UK, that we needed to try and look at. There was no, or very, very little automatic number plate recognition in those days. And that's how we had the spectacle of, 4 of London's finest murder detectives standing on a bridge over the A316 taking car numbers. And that was probably the lowest point of the entire investigation for me, because it was kind of one of those situations where I'd sunk everything into identifying this van, and it kind of wasn't working. And I was left back at the office at Barnes, as we were then. A woman came into the mobile police station and she suggested it was her ex-partner, and that man was Levi Bellfield. Once we'd identified who he was, we wanted to try to find the white van. It was decided that Bellfield was going to be put under surveillance 24/7 in the hope he'd lead us to the van. During the time he was under surveillance, one Sunday afternoon, it was when he went and had a conversation with 2 young girls at a bus stop and asking them questions about their sex life. And they were like 14 and 15. And the surveillance team did absolutely the right thing. And when he left them, they got on a bus. And when he left them, the surveillance team peeled off one car which followed the bus. And when these 2 girls got off the bus, they spoke to them. And that's how they know what the conversation was about. And they made a statement. And after 10 days, and he hadn't led us to the van, we arrested him at his home address in West Drayton. He'd been seen to go in there at about sort of 3 a.m. by the surveillance team. He's hiding in the loft. So I've then got the problem that you need to try and get somebody out from a loft who you want for killing people by hitting them across the head. And of course, the first thing you do when you're trying to get into a loft is put your head up through the hatch, isn't it? And so I decided that probably we needed some officers with helmets and shields and possibly even a dog, and put a dog up there first of all, and that would be the way to do it. And I'm frantically trying to arrange those sort of resources and assistance like you do, and the phone rings again, and the sergeant says, "Don't worry, we've got him." So I said, "How have you got him?" He said, "I just went up the ladder and arrested him." I said, "Oh, okay, you're very naughty. You shouldn't have done that." But thanks. And he was arrested, and he was hiding naked under the fiberglass loft insulation in his loft, which must have been pretty uncomfortable, I would have thought. But he said to us, "Oh, I was only hiding because I thought it was a gang. I thought it was, somebody after me." Well, it was somebody after you, Levi, but it was the murder squad.
What was Levi Bellfield charged with?
He was arrested for the murder of Amélie, the attempted murder of another lady in Twickenham, and an attack on a lady who we think he assaulted in Hampton Road near Twickenham Green in 2002 or 2003. We didn't have enough evidence to charge the other things. Levi's then partner, the woman he was living with at that time, had 3 children with. She started making the disclosures about the abuse and sexual abuse and violence that she'd suffered at his hands, and realised that this was her opportunity to break away from this abusive, violent relationship that she had. And so she did, and she had great courage. Not only were we able to charge him with the offences against her, but she also said, well, his 2 previous partners, I've spoken to them, and they suffered the same. And we went to them and they confirmed that. From that day, the 20th of November 2004, he never saw the light of day again.
What did you learn about Levi Bellfield?
Levi's ex-partner, she tells stories of him sitting her on a stool in the kitchen and saying, "You're not to move until I come back," and she'd spend literally hours there. She'd wet herself while she was there because she was so frightened to move. I mean, other partners told us about him locking them in the house and takes the key away so they can't go out while he's away. We get the report we've had, which says, "My ex-partner, Levi Bellfield, is a very violent man. He has got a hatred of women, particularly blondes. I found a magazine where he stabbed through all the photographs of blonde girls in it. He's very weird, and it's just the sort of thing he'd want to do. And he now works as a wheel clamper and uses a little white van to do it." So, that's exactly what we're looking for, somebody who's got a small white van. And what had happened, when we were looking at the Ford Courier vans that were registered in the local area, one was registered to a garage in Isleworth. And it just so happened that officers had been to see the garage, and he'd said, "Oh no, I don't have that anymore." He said, "That's I sold it. I sold it to a guy called Levi." I didn't get a second name from him. He said, but he left a mobile phone number and gave me an address. So I asked somebody then to get me an intelligence printout, what was known about Levi Bellfield, every sort of contact he'd had with police. And one of the times that he was arrested was in May 2004, when he was arrested for kidnap, which was kidnapping the landlord of a pub near where he lived in West Drayton. And the crucial thing was that abduction took place indeed in a vehicle, and that vehicle was a white Toyota Previa. That made me sort of take notice because I'd looked at the case of Kate Sheedy.
Who was Kate Sheedy?
Kate was the head girl at her girls' school in Twickenham, and she'd been with a load of school friends to Twickenham Town Centre on the day that they finished doing their school lessons before they took their final A-level exams. And Kate left on a bus, went home on a bus, much like Marsha McDonnell did, much like Amélie did, went on a bus back to her mother's home in Isleworth. She got off the bus to walk a few hundred yards back to the house. And as she did so, she's walking along the road and she's aware up ahead of her was a people carrier that was sitting parked with the engine running but the lights off. She crossed the road. She heard this people carrier start up, accelerate, and it literally did a U-turn, came across the road and simply ran into her, just ran her over. And she ended up on the road between the front wheels and the back wheels of the people carrier. It then reversed, so the front wheels went over her body again and drove off. And Kate sort of crawled onto the relative safety of the pavement, managed to find her mobile phone and call 999 herself. Kate's offence was being investigated by the borough, the local detectives, because it wasn't a murder, because she'd survived. That's how the system works. But we were aware of it, and officers on my team had said, we ought to have a look at it just in case. Although it's similar in its outcome, and it's similar in the area where it took place, and the age and the victim and what she looks like and all this sort of thing. It's just the weapon, substitute car for hammer, and it's the same. And we found out that Levi Bellfield had a Toyota Previa at that time. That Levi Bellfield had been arrested in May, the same month that Kate Sheedy had been attacked with a people carrier. There's Levi Bellfield being arrested in a people carrier. I got somebody to go and do a check on the number plate of the Previa that Levi had been arrested in and said it was white. And I remember her saying to me, Governor, I think we might have hit the jackpot. And she was right, because we now had somebody, Levi Bellfield, who had the right kind of white van that was used at the time Amélie Delagrange was murdered, and the right type of vehicle at the time that Kate Sheedy was run over. After we'd arrested Levi, it was about 4 months after Amélie was murdered, but we took responsibility for Kate's case.
What was it like meeting Bellfield in custody?
I extended a hand to say hello, because you need to have a relationship with these people, even if they're murderers or whatever. You need to or something. And he just pulled his hand away and said, "Fuck off, prick." So I thought, okay, fine. That's how we're going to be. That's going to characterise our relationship for the rest of this investigation. And it did. Initially, wanted to talk to us and wanted to protest his innocence and spoke to us, and which quite surprised me. And he had a solicitor there, and solicitor said, "No, if you want to speak, you should speak to the officers, Levi." So he did, and he started denying things, but he was talking to us and denying them. And what happened was that we then had the allegations made by his partner that he'd abused, assaulted, sexually assaulted. But when she'd been the victim of domestic violence from Levi, she'd used the same solicitor that was at the police station to organise her splitting up with him and so forth. And that meant there was a conflict of interest, and that solicitor couldn't represent Levi as in the criminal proceedings. So we had to get the duty solicitor, and that was the end of Levi talking to us. The new solicitor advised him to make no comment, and he made no comment on virtually every other question that was asked of him. But interestingly, I say that, but you could engage him. Occasionally, you could engage him, often by showing him documents, maps, photographs, things like that. And he found it difficult to resist. He wouldn't just sit there and not look at them. He'd take them and look, and then he'd start speaking. And he almost did it in a way He realised then that he'd spoken, he wasn't meant to speak. I think secretly he wanted to talk. I don't think he wanted to talk because he wanted to admit anything. He wanted to talk because he thought he would get the better of the officers that were interviewing him. Nothing ever matters to Levi apart from Levi. Or possibly his mother. But certainly not his children, his girlfriend, his wife, partner, or anyone else. He'll have thought it through and thought, how does Levi Bellfield come out of this with the best outcome? How's this most beneficial to me? And when you combine that with somebody who's got a kind of sadism and kind of a propensity to use violence in the way that he has, and he's quite a physically large person as well, then you've got a really dangerous mix. I had the honour, in some ways, the dubious honour of formally charging him with my offences, and it's to have stood across the table and looked him in the eye and sort of laid out what he was accused of, was a very kind of special moment for me, because we'd put an awful lot of work into this. But you look across the table charging him and he's just got these coal black eyes, there was just not a flicker of emotion, never was a flicker of emotion with him.
What was Bellfield's MO?
As we got into the investigation with Amelie's murder, there's good reason to suspect that what happened in these cases was actually Levi Bellfield was making some sort of verbal approach from his car, and it was when he was rebuffed on that's what flicked the switch in his head. That's what triggered the assaults. We've got good reason to think that from the timing of Amélie Delagrange's walk, and where Levi Bellfield must have seen her on that walk, and how long it took for her to get from there to the next camera where we know she was. So we're pretty sure that she stopped to speak and she was engaged by Levi on the street like that for Kate's case. The only thing we can think is that Bellfield is in the car. We'd subsequently found out, looking at CCTV, Levi Bellfield has trailed her in the bus for some miles. Of course, buses are all lit up inside, aren't they? When they get to stops, they light up even more at night. So it's easy to see in through the glass, through the windows, and see who's in there. And it looks like he sort of selected her as a potential victim. When the bus stops and she gets off, he must have overtaken her. And we think he was probably, it's the same story. He wanted to make some kind of approach, advance verbally to Kate as she passed the car. Now, whereas in the case of Marsha and Amélie, that advance is rebuffed and that causes him to react violently, it didn't even get that far with Kate, because he thwarts him by walking onto the other side of the road. And it looks like this is the trigger. You think you're that clever, do you? And so you have an attack that's grounded in the same desires and the same kind of method, really, although the weapon is very, very different.
What happened at the trial?
The court case started in October 2007. It lasted for about 5 months. And I was there every day apart from one. Levi thought he could talk his way out of anything, and he thought he was going to talk his way out of this. There was no fingerprint, there was no DNA, there was no picture of him with the weapon or anything like that. But the case that we'd put together gave him very little chance to come up with an excuse. And we had 65,000 documents we had to disclose to the defence. And Levi was in the dock sitting behind us, and he's very respectful to the judge. And when the jury are in, and yes, your ladyship, no, your ladyship, and so forth. The second the jury were out, the second the judge was out, he would be making faces at Amelie's parents. He would be talking in a stage whisper to people and saying unpleasant things about police officers or the victims. It's a thoroughly nasty piece of work for our trial. In February 2008, we had half a dozen victims whose cases had never been before the court and never would, who turned up to see him get sentenced and see him go away forever. There was another series of offences where Levi Bellfield committed rape, drug-induced rape on teenage girls between the ages of 13 and 16. And there were 5 offences that I'm happy we could have proved. and the CPS sort of said, look, we can't add them to the indictment for the murders because it gets too complicated for the jury. But what we did was we got all the victims, all the young girls and the other victims of his offences that we couldn't charge, and we kind of brought them into the family almost and said, look, it's just not possible to charge him with every single one of your offences. But what we want you to do is to realise that the most important thing for everybody is that this man goes to prison forever. And actually her justice is your justice, her justice is your justice. And we had this kind of fair network. The jury were out for a number of days, week and a half, 2 weeks. And eventually we got word that there'd come some verdicts, and they had found unanimously that he was guilty of murdering Amélie, and by a majority that he was guilty of murdering Marsha and of attempting to murder Kate. The rather odd thing was that there were 2 other offences on the indictment where we had direct evidence, an ID parade, identification and an eyewitness. They were the ones the jury couldn't agree on. The 3 offences where we just had circumstantial evidence and where the cross-admissibility of evidence supported, the 3 cases supported each other, they were the ones that we got convictions on. That's juries for you. The sentence was put off the next day. We all knew and guessed he would get whole life tariffs because that's what what he had to get. He refused to come out of his cell. He wouldn't come up and hear what the judge said about him, wouldn't be up in court there actually to be sent down to start his sentence.
What was your reaction to the verdict?
All the emotions you can think of, relief, that you'd done something that you'd wanted to see happen, that you'd kind of rehearsed in your mind so many times that this is how it was going to end. You're just so relieved for the families who've got justice. It never brings back their loved ones. Of course it doesn't. It's the very best you can do for them, but it's still hopeless, really, in some ways. And then I got called into the witness box by the judge as well to be commended, and for me and the team to take her kind of commendation. And it was one of the most emotional moments of my life, really. It really was. And it's just a job, really, isn't it? But it's not. It's so much more than that. When you invest, and it wasn't just me. When my team invested so much of their life, so much of their lives and their working lives into this one investigation, it was one of the most indescribably intense emotional feelings when we finally got there.
Were there other victims?
The link was being made by the media and by the public because Amélie's phone was found at Walton-on-Thames, which of course was the last place Millie Dowler was seen. At that time, we didn't realise that actually the link was Levi Bellfield, who lived in Walton-on-Thames and actually was involved with both. Millie was walking home from school, having got off a train, walking back past a bus stop. She wasn't going to get on a bus. She was walking past a bus stop, which was literally just outside Levi's house. 20 minutes later, Levi's girlfriend's car, the red Day next to, is seen driving out of the road where he lived and not seen coming back again. And Millie was found 6 months later in woods in Hampshire. And the interesting thing about that is it's always with Levi somewhere where he's got an attachment. He's got, he went back to Walton-on-Thames and threw Amélie's things into the river because that was where he used to go fishing. And Minley Heath Woods, where Millie's body was found, is somewhere that Levi was used to going with his girlfriend's show jumping. There was a show jumping venue there. Millie Dowler's abduction and murder was a Surrey police offence and investigated by Surrey police. I told Surrey police in 2004 that we'd identified Levi Bellfield as the suspect for our offences and that I knew he lived 20 yards away from where Millie was last seen at the time she was abducted, and given that he ought to be looked at. And from that day on, in kind of late 2004, early 2005, we were talking to Surrey Police and the Operation Ruby, the Millie Dowler investigation team. I think it was 2007 they first interviewed him for the Millie Dowler offence, and he commented. And they were tenacious with it, Surrey. They carried on and carried on. It wasn't until 2010 that they charged him with that offence. And it was very much like our investigation into Amélie and Marsha's murders and Kate's attempted murder. There was no forensic evidence. There was no smoking gun anywhere. They had to build a case with what people had been saying, with little facts, with phone evidence. But the whole thing came back to us knowing what Levi Bellfield had done on the night that Millie Dowler was abducted. He was convicted of Millie Dowler's murder. He did it again. I'm sure that Levi Bellfield's responsible for many, many more crimes than we kind of accept that he is. Whether there are other murders he's committed that we don't know about, I'm not so sure. There were very few offences of blitz attack offences of women being hit on the back of the head by strangers in London, and all but one of those that we found we could reasonably put down to Levi Bellfield. He was ruthless, he was violent, he was sociopathic, I'm sure. So who knows what else he might have done.
On the 25th of February 2008, 39-year-old Levi Bellfield was given 3 life sentences for the murders of Amélie Delagrange and Marsha McDonnell, and the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. Over 3 years later, Bellfield was issued another life sentence for the murder of Millie Dowler. He is currently serving his whole life tariff at HMP Frankland. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the investigation to catch the bus stop killer. For more stories from Britain's underworld, make sure to like and subscribe, and comment below what stories you'd like to see on this channel. This is Matt from Underworld Uncut. See you on the next one.